What made these battles the three battles with some of the highest casualty numbers for Americans during World War II? Let's begin by looking at arguably the most famous battle fought by Americans during the war, the Battle of the Bulge. By late 1944, the Allied forces were on Germany's doorstep. The Allies ruled the air and had been steadily gaining ground since the Normandy landings on June 6th of that year. No one was expecting what came on December 16th. Hitler launched what would be his last great offensive of the war. He threw hundreds of tanks and over 200,000 men at the Allied lines in the Ardennes forest, in an operation known as Wacht am Rhein, or the Watch on the Rhine. The goal was to cross the Meuse River and capturing the Allied supply center of Antwerp. The Germans succeeded in gaining ground in the initial attack due to the element of surprise, but the tides turned by early January, as pockets of Allied resistance halted the rapid German movement that was so desperately needed for German success in the operation. After 41 days, the Germans began to retreat. Hitler's final offensive gamble had disastrously failed, marking the true beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge resulted in roughly 80,000 American casualties, with the main reason for the high casualties being Germany's element of surprise, the large scale of the offensive, war weariness and lack of supplies within the Allied lines, and the desperate last-ditch effort nature of the German attack. The Battle of Normandy, also known as the Invasion of Normandy, was in reality a series of battles and skirmishes to gain an Allied foothold in northern France. A plan for a cross-channel invasion of Europe had been in the making for over 2 years, with earlier plans such as Operation Sledgehammer being scrapped in favor for a Northern Africa Allied offensive. Intensified planning began in December of 1943, when General Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. His goal was to orchestrate what would be the largest sea-to-land invasion in history. I won't get too deep into the logistics and history of D-Day, as I plan to make a video on that in the future. 5 infantry divisions consisting of 2 American, 2 British, and 1 Canadian were assigned a landing zone across the beaches of Normandy. These landing zones were given code names. American forces were to land at Utah and Omaha beaches. The British were to take Gold and Sword beaches, and the Canadians were to take Juno Beach. On June 5, 1944, the Normandy landings known as Operation Overlord were put into action when unexpected bad weather set in. Eisenhower made the tough decision to delay the operation by 24 hours. In the extreme early morning hours of June 6th, thousands of paratroopers were dropped into northern France, behind enemy lines. At 6:30 a.m., the main beach invasions began. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 Allied troops had landed on the beaches, but their job had just begun. The Allies needed to secure nearby towns and objectives to ensure a foothold was maintained in France. By June 27th, American forces had captured Cherbourg, and by July 20th, the British and Canadian forces had captured Caen. And finally, on July 24th and 25th, American forces launched an assault known as Operation Cobra, and successfully breached German lines near a town called Saint-Lô, ending what is known as the Battle of Normandy. In total, the Battle of Normandy resulted in roughly 135,000 American casualties, with most casualties occurring due to the strategic German defenses along the coast, as well as operational failures such as scattered landings of the paratroopers and inaccuracy of Allied bombardments. The Battle of Okinawa saw some of the most brutal fighting experienced by any American during the war. After taking Iwo Jima, Okinawa was the last major obstacle before the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. By taking Okinawa, the US would easily be in striking distance of Japan by air, meaning that taking the island was of great importance to the US, and keeping the island was even more pivotal for the Japanese forces. The main landings of the Battle of Okinawa began at 8:30 a.m. on April 1st, 1945. Roughly 60,000 Americans stormed a 5-mile stretch of beaches on the western side of Okinawa. For the most part, there was initially little to no resistance, and by April 4th, the American forces controlled the northern half of the island. Over the ensuing days, the Japanese forces launched their first major counterattack, revealing that they were heavily dug into the southern half of the island. By April 18th, the Americans reached the anchor point of the Japanese forces, the historic Shuri Castle. The remainder of the 130,000 Japanese soldiers were prepared to fight to the death, with hundreds of accounts of Japanese kamikaze attacks on American ground troops and the American fleet offshore. Progress was slow, but by May 29th, the Japanese defense at Shuri Castle fell, and the Naha airfield was secured on June 4th. But the Japanese were not done fighting, holding out until June 22nd when the remaining 7,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered. In total, the Americans suffered over 49,000 casualties in over 2 months of fighting for the island, with the relentless fight-to-the-death nature of the Japanese forces being the obvious cause for such high casualty numbers. In each of these battles, the Axis powers sustained equally astonishing casualties, with the Germans sustaining up to 100,000 casualties at the Battle of the Bulge, and an estimated 320,000 casualties during the Normandy invasion, while the Japanese sustained over 110,000 casualties during the Battle of Okinawa.